One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Over the last couple of years, it's become pretty obvious that something is happening in the world of beer and brewing. I mean, on this show alone, we've brought it up several times and have dedicated a few entire episodes to the fact things are changing, and not necessarily in the best of ways. The excitement over beer is waning, meaning less people are spending their hard-earned money at local breweries. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to share our views on the sharp rise in recent brewery closures is contributor Jordan Folks.
Yeah, it's always sad to see a brewery close. And, you know, sometimes it's like a little dinky one down the street that wasn't that good. Or other times it's like a massive commercial craft brewery. And it's like, what the heck is going on? So maybe today we can try to unpack some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, while I've technically been involved in the brewing industry via Brewlosophy for over a decade at this point, I have very intentionally never made the move from homebrewing to pro. And there are several reasons for that. As enticing as owning my own brewery has been at times, which I'm sure most homebrewers can relate with, I can honestly say that given the state of brewing of right now where we're at today, I feel very fortunate to not have to be in the position so many of our pro brewing friends currently are in, some of whom, you know, are out there who haven't even been around for very long. So things pretty much suck right now. We all know that, and the uptick in brewery closures is proof of that. I look forward to hearing your opinions on all of this, Jordan, as well as sharing some of my own. Now, just a reminder, this is a Brews Views episode where we kind of allow ourselves to let loose a little bit more than usual. So heads up, we might use some language that some people don't like or share opinions that you disagree with. That's kind of the nature of this series. So please remember that. It's not our point to offend anybody, but to have an honest conversation in a less filtered way. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in July of 2024, brewing and beer steward instructor at Dakota County Technical College in Rosemont, Minnesota, Andrew Burns will be taking questions from patrons. In addition to his vast experience in both home and professional brewing, Andrew has been a guest on the Brew Lab podcast, where he's discussed various options for getting a brewing education, something all of us here at Brewlosophy probably agree is very important, particularly for those considering going pro. Andrew's going to be hanging out with patrons on Saturday, July 27th, 2024, so make sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday the 26th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Also, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, that would be awesome too. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems. These things are absolutely legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You are not going to be disappointed with one of these units. I promise you that. Plus, the folks behind the company run a killer YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear or even just reasonably priced kettles and such, you make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer over at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know that Brewlosophy sent you and you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Okay, listener Noam Shalev from Israel wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 336, where Alex and I talked about the no-chill method. Noam said, as a home brewer who's been using no-chill exclusively for over 14 years, I have a couple of comments. In the experiment, Alex left the chilled batch for 24 hours before pitching the yeast. That would be my biggest concern over all others, and it could also explain the unusual flavor picked up in the chilled beer. I personally use an HDPE2 cube for no chilling, as I've seen cases where, as the wort decreases in temperature inside a stainless vessel, it can actually collapse the vessel inwards as the volume of wort contracts. And just to point out the biggest advantage I see with no chilling, I love the fact that my brew day is over when the boil is done. The whole pitching and fermentation stage is an entirely separate part of my home brewing. When the process is broken up into more manageable time slots, it's a lot easier to fit into your daily routine. What do you think, Jordan?
I totally relate to that. I've never done a no-chill brew myself for that exact reason. Just the idea of the beer or the wort sitting overnight kind of freaks me out. So I would, I understand the hesitation there for letting it go that long. That being said, I think a lot of people are probably doing that successfully. And so as long as everything's closed and, boiled and sealed, it seems like it'd be fine.
Yeah. Look, there are a lot of no-chill brewers out there, at least 15 or 20 of them, as far as I can tell, maybe times 100 or so. So I will say that I'm a little confused about why Gnome thinks the quick chilled beer had the unusual flavor Alex described. It sounds like what he might be, trying to say here is that the 24-hour rest before pitching the yeast may have led to some weird flavor development, which, just to be clear, Alex did that just to ensure that the beers were treated as equally as possible. That's not a part of his typical process to let the beer sit or the wort sit for 24 hours before pitching. Now, I've actually done that before and didn't notice any off flavors at all, really. But perhaps Gnome has had a different experience. I really don't know. Either way, it's great to hear from folks who have been successfully using methods like no chill for so long, as it gives even more anecdotal evidence that methods like this, which are very simple and really do make the brew day easier, work, at least for some people. And the subjective opinions of the brewer are probably what matter the most. So as for the potential of collapsing a stainless keg when using it as the no-chill vessel, I've never heard of like a keg actually collapsing, but even so, I'm not sure how that would affect the perceptible characteristics of the beer. It might screw up your keg a little bit, but maybe it would have some perceptible impact. I really don't know. Either way, thank you for reaching out, Gnome. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show. No umlaut needed. If you're listening to this podcast right now, we're confident you're going to love the videos Martin's creating over at YouTube as well. When we're back from this break, our views on brewery closures. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
My obsession with craft beer began back in probably 2002, pretty soon after I turned 21. Now, I was living in Bellingham, Washington at the time, and at that time, they only had one brewery. Shout out to Boundary Bay. As fortunate as I felt to have that, my options were limited to whatever they had on tap at the brewery or at local stores, whatever they had on their shelves, which wasn't horrible, but it also wasn't great. Well, within a decade of that time, the craft beer landscape had changed massively. Breweries were popping up everywhere, and it seemed pretty much everyone was enjoying spending time and money at their local, craft watering hole. The growth was tremendous. Craft beer was on a seemingly endless upward trajectory. That is until it wasn't, which is sadly where we're sitting today. This is obviously a huge and arguably convoluted topic, which is why we selected it for a Brews Views episode. As much, everything you hear about the rising number of brewery closures is largely conjecture at this point, a matter of one's subjective opinion. Now, Jordan, you live in what I would contend is one of the great craft beer meccas of the world, Portland, Oregon, and I've heard of some rather surprising closures coming from that area recently.
Yeah, we have. I don't think that anyone's immune to it, and I think that part of it's going to be a function of scale. Yep. There's about 100 craft breweries in the city or so, and inevitably there's going to be some turnover there. But look at how far we've come. Bellingham, right? They must at least have 10.
I think they have 13 now, something like that. Yeah.
Right. So a 10-ish fold increase from not that long ago. So I think that does speak to a bit of market saturation, and there's going to inevitably be some turnover there. And so we're seeing that from the smallest towns to the biggest cities, right? And when you live in a city like Portland, you're going to see some turnover, and we've seen some pretty notable ones lately, and it's really sad. But as much as we're going to opine on this today, just probably good to clarify, we're not industry analyst experts.
Yeah.
We're kind of going from our gut here, but I think that you and me know a bit about this industry and might have some clues as to what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's an important, we try to point that out in all of these Brews Views episodes. When the reason we created this series was basically a place for a couple of blowhards to blow hard, to just kind of shoot the shit about specific topics that are relevant to beer and brewing, and doing it in a way where we can share our opinions with that as well. And that's absolutely the case here with this whole brewery closures topic. We're not on the inside necessarily of each one of these breweries, and we don't know what's actually going on, but there do seem to be some trends, we've been around long enough to where there was talk 10 years ago about this potentially happening and why it might happen. So we are going to get more into some of our ideas as to why this is happening right now and what, could be contributing to it for specific types of breweries. We'll get into that. But first, I want to know, you mentioned that some breweries have been closing, some notable breweries even have been closing down, in the Portland area or around where you're at now. I want to talk a little bit about some of those without really getting into the whys yet, because I think it's curious to hear some of the names associated with closing down. Here in Fresno, at least, we're not necessarily known for being a huge city, but we experienced something similar to most other cities in the last 20 years, which was, there was one brewery for a long time, and now I think we've got 14 or 15 as well, just in this area alone. And yeah, we've been seeing some interesting stuff happen over the last 3 or 4 years. Probably the most notable that comes to mind here is Tac Ops Brewing, who closed back in February of 2024. These were a good group of dudes, who did a lot for the veteran community. In fact, one of the owner's brother was a fighter pilot with Jersey. That was the theme of their brewery. They were pretty far from my place, so when I went down there, it was usually for events and such. But a loss is a loss. I was bummed to hear they were closing up shop.
Right. And I could name ones that people that aren't from Portland have never heard of, and I could name ones that maybe people all across the world have heard of that have recently closed or closed in the last few years. Just the other day, it was announced that Cascade Brewing, basically the foundation of the modern sour beer movement, shuttered its doors just out of nowhere, and employees walked in on a Monday and were handed their final paycheck.
That is just, yeah, good Lord. I mean, it's sad, but it's also crazy, you know?
It's crazy. And I in no way am throwing shade at that brewery. In the next segment, we can get into why they closed. And I think that what we'll see is there's a lot of different reasons why breweries might close. Yeah. And it's not necessarily that they're failing. Recently, also, the kind of the grandfather of the modern innovative cider movement, Reverend Nat, closed his doors as well in Portland, and that was a huge blow to fans of interesting ciders around the world. And he did a podcast episode following the closure, and he said, we weren't failing. I just felt, after 20 years or whatever it had been, it was time to move on and do something else in my life. He actually is running for city council. So there's just various reasons, but it's just really crazy and sad to see these really stalwarts of the craft industry closing. And it's sad to see the little guys that are just trying to get going too, close too.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I actually know of a good handful of people, even just locally, but given, our reach with Brewlosophy, I've heard from people around the US at least, who had been, planning on starting a brewery, and they had high hopes because of just how rapidly this industry was growing, and they're completely out of it now. I mean, it's not even an option for them, because the thing about a brewery is it's a job. You got to be able to support your family and support a crew of people to run the business, help you run the business, brew the beer, sell the beer, all of that stuff. So it is a bummer of a time that we're in right now. You mentioned Cascade. When I saw that headline, I was kind of had to sit back and go, wait a minute, hold on. Wow. Cascade. And it really got me thinking about something. So back in 2022, there was news that the Rare Barrel sold to Cellar Maker, and they admitted that it was just the hit from the pandemic was a driving factor to them kind of getting out of it and just letting go when they could, kind of count your losses and get the F out. What that got me thinking about though was, for those of us who have been around long enough, I'd say 15 plus years, we saw craft beer when it was kind of on the verges of exploding. We watched that rocket take off, and now here we are looking back going, whoa. And I think that's part of what hits so hard for people like us, Jordan, is that we've seen the growth. We've developed relationships with a lot of these people, and to see them kind of go under, it's almost like the end of this era that we were completely a part of, which feels, existentially speaking, feels very odd, but when I think about Cascade, and then I look at the Rare Barrel, and then I just kind of look at brewing, the talk and the kind of nature of where people are at these days, I can't help but wonder, on a very specific level, if there's just been this kind of waning interest in sour beer in general, maybe. And that, I mean, I always wondered how places like the Rare Barrel, who are phenomenal, if their sole thing is sour beer, I mean, that's such a small segment of the collective palate, if you will.
Totally. You are 100% on the money there. Look at Almanac. They don't just make sour beer anymore. Yeah. You go to their tap room and it's like hazy, West Coast, Pilsner, Helles. Oh, there's a couple sours too.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that when craft beer was taking off, a big part of it was recreation of classic European styles. Yeah. People were tired of yellow, fizzy, light beer. And as good as that may be, they wanted variety, right? And so things like porter, amber, etc., were really exploding in this kind of microbrew scene. Yeah. And Belgian-informed sours were one of those. And we've kind of come back to the full circle now, and all people care about now are IPAs and lagers. And I'm in that boat to a certain extent. I brew, and when I go out, those are the type 2 beers I typically purchase. Yeah. And in my brewing, those are 2 of the most common. I also brew Belgian and mixed firm, sour type beers as well. But nonetheless, it seems like the explosion in craft beer was surrounding a desire for diversity and new flavors. And people now, 20 years later, have tasted amber and they decided, I think I like lager, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. We actually talked about that recently on the Patreon. The Q&A session was like this interesting evolution from, most beer drinkers start off drinking, Bud Miller, Coors, whatever. They might get introduced to something like an amber ale or a Hefeweizen, the kind of the popular craft beer styles. That puts them on the ship towards going and trying all of these other styles. But then eventually they come back around and it's like, you know what? I just want a nice Miller Lite. I want a crisp German Pils. And it's interesting because most people I know have been on that cycle. And I think it's a fascinating thing to watch, and to see. We're seeing it in the industry now as well, or at least it seems that way. Another big brewery, we can't really talk about brewery closures without talking about Anchor Brewing. That was a shock for me when I heard in 2023, so a little over a year ago now, that not only were they closing up, but they're closing up and getting the hell out, and everyone who worked there had like a month to pack up and go. That I would never, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if you'd asked me to bet, put bets on what breweries were going to be closing down, they would have been near the bottom of my list, but here we are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the original or one of the original craft brewers of America closing. That's just so heartbreaking. I know. And if I believe you told me once you never did the tour, right?
No.
Dude, it was so cool to get to see you get to see the giant like Olympic-sized swimming pool, open fermentation. And you get to see their historic copper kettles, and then at the end of the tour, you get to it's all you can drink for 45 minutes. And not that the intention is to get like blasted, but it's cool because you can try so much stuff, including kegged that day or the day before. Yeah. Anchor Steam, and like classic styles that you've kind of heard of but don't really ever actually drink, like Liberty Ale or Anchor Porter. And then they have like a bottle library, and if you talk them up enough, they'll can go down, and like they popped like a 1970s Christmas ale for me, and it was the worst beer I've ever had. It tastes like dirt water, 50 years later. But it was such an incredible personal real experience, and the fact that is gone, not to mention how incredible that beer was in general, it's really sad. And I think that's one of the things that we see is it goes both ways. There are breweries that are too small and they're not selling enough beer. You pointed out this little Czech brewer in Texas recently. That was their case, right? Yeah. Too small of a market, not selling enough Czech beer. And then you have breweries that get too big. And we would see that all the time in the last 10 years or so. Breweries, they would announce an expansion, and then a year later they would announce a closure. Yeah,
you've got to make money to keep a business going, or to keep even side, parts of your business going. Now, what we're talking about now is kind of this 1,000-foot view of where we're at with these brewery closures and such. And you look at something like Anchor Brewing, and for those who keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the craft beer world, you may have read that they were recently acquired. Anchor Brewing was recently acquired by, I guess, the person who started Chobani Yogurt or something like that empire. And it made me think of something kind of, I've always been one who, when these big, breweries or whatever, the big conglomerates were buying out these craft breweries, and you had all these people say, oh, that's the end of craft beer and yada, yada. Well, it may very well be that they're the reason that craft beer stays around as well. Who knows? But when you've got Chobani, which, let's be real, they're like the Budweiser of yogurt, when they're buying out Anchor Brewing, one of the original craft breweries, and everyone's throwing their hands up cheering that, yay, we may still get Anchor Steam. I mean, we've got to at least back off a little bit of the presumed, or our presumptions as to where these things are going to go because somebody else got their money involved. That's my view. Of course, this is an opinion show, but I do think it's interesting that given the state that we're in with craft brewing now, the thought of a big conglomerate buying out Anchor Brewing and them staying alive is actually more of a positive thing than I guarantee it would have been 10 years ago.
Well, and actually, I think the Anchor case is really interesting and actually really inspiring. And I'm not so sure that it was a corporate conglomerate that bought out Anchor, and I could be wrong, but I think it's actually the dude, that the inventor of Chobani. It's a really fascinating story. He was an immigrant from, I think, the Middle East, and he moved to New York, and then his dad was like a cheesemaker, and so he came from this cheesemaking family, and he saw this shuttered factory, and he turned it into a Greek yogurt factory, and everyone was telling him you can't do this. This doesn't make sense. There's a reason this thing closed. It was owned by one of the biggest cheesemakers in the world. If they can't do it, why could you do it? Yeah. And he hired everyone back. And there's a TED Talk online. It's a really inspiring piece. And so he's has just this heart of gold that he portrays, that he's really interested in bringing back union jobs, union manufacturing jobs. I think he himself might have used his fortune to purchase it with the explicit intention of bringing the crew back and bringing American-made unionized beer back to America.
I mean, that is, I didn't know the intricacies of that story. If that's the case, regardless, that's just a great story. It's pretty inspiring, like you said. I just, at the same time, I think that there's just, it's so easy for us to view, certain bigger companies, we'll just put it that way, as being with disdain, as just being ultimately evil, when really they're keeping a lot of people, in jobs and stuff like that as well. And regardless of who it is, the fact that somebody with a bunch of money, which that gets shit on a lot in this culture these days anyways, is coming in and could potentially save hundreds of jobs for the people of San Francisco. I think it's great. So, but yeah, Anchor Brewing, God, I cannot wait. Hopefully we get to see some steam on the shelves again soon. I'll even stop calling my California Common steam beer once they. But there's a bunch of kind of spitball reasons that we can talk about for why this is happening. We're going to have to break it up. We'll start now and we'll finish the rest in the next segment. But the first thing that comes to my mind, and I think it's the most obvious one, is just the change in the economy, perhaps as a function of the COVID pandemic, where people just couldn't go out and drink because everything was closed, and you saw these breweries trying to get creative and shipping beer out. I even got involved in some of that because, hey, for one, I can get some beers that I wouldn't have access to otherwise, but also, let me do what I can to help these breweries out. There's no way that could have been enough, right, to bring in the revenue that they would have been making had their doors been open.
Well, I think that it was a mixed bag. If I recall correctly, I think some breweries were up and others were down. Obviously, a big part of that was the business model, as whether it was over-the-counter sales or packaged grocery store, et cetera, sales. And so the COVID pandemic, I think, was really consequential on the explosion of smaller breweries canning and mobile canning operations, and also breweries that previously were keg only. And so maybe you'd see a keg at like a beer bar or like a nicer restaurant or something. But generally speaking, if you wanted to drink that brewery's beer, you had to go there. That day is kind of gone. Everyone's canning now, and you might even see the tiniest craft brewery, their cans in your local grocery store or liquor store. Not to mention you can get cans to go. And so it's probably related to the rise and demise of the bottle too as a format. Somehow just the odds aligned, and COVID came, and then boom, cans are now the name of the game. And so what that meant was that a lot of breweries had to shift to packaged sales, and they've continued that to this day. Now, they've seen the package sales go down, but there was an increase in American drinking during lockdown.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But as you know, there's a dramatically different revenue associated with over-the-counter sales versus through the grocery store distribution sales.
Yeah.
And so then it's a whole change in like the economics of the brewery and incoming revenue, et cetera, because they're not able to charge the same amount per ounce for a grocery store sale as they can at their bar. Not to mention there's no middleman, so they get 100% of the cut, at least in most states. Yeah. Not
only that, I mean, you think about, so when you're distributing beer, so I not only do I have to pay for the canner, do I have to pay for the cans, do I have to pay for the people who are doing that job and canning that beer, the labor for it. But now I'm making less revenue, on it. And it's just, in my opinion, it's just a lose-lose, particularly for smaller breweries who don't have the ability or just can't afford really to go that route, and you pay a mobile canner. Now you're paying a premium because that mobile canner has to make some coin on it. It really, so that piece of it I think is unavoidable. And I do wonder what other like psychological impacts just being locked up for at least a year, depending on where you lived and not going out to breweries to drink. I just wonder what kind of psychological impact that had on some people. The obvious other thing that's been going on is the inflation, the overall increased cost of goods, or COG. And I did a little bit of poking around, Jordan, and it didn't take very long for me to find this. But if you look at from 2016 to 2020, the average inflation rate, annual inflation rate, was 1.96% per year. So year over year, just under 2%. In 2021, it was 7%. In 2022, it was 6.5%. And in 2023, it was 3.4. 2024, so far, we're at 3.3. So we are still almost double what we were prior to the pandemic happening. That has an absolute impact on industries like beer and brewing, because everything they're paying for to make that beer went up in cost. Now they're having to charge $8 a pint as opposed to $6 a pint 5 years ago. And yet people's paychecks haven't changed nearly as much. And I think that's contributing to it as well.
Yeah. And it kind of goes both ways too, because beer is, to a certain extent, kind of a commodity in Western culture, and their patrons or customers just aren't willing to pay hand over fist for beer. It's seen as like the every person's beverage, and so there's a limit to what the market will bear in terms of cost increase.
Yeah.
And so whenever I travel to California, I'm like, dear God, you guys are charging a lot for beer. And it's honestly not just California. It's somehow Oregon is kind of like been immune to this, because we brew our beer and we're going to keep it affordable. But when I travel outside of this state, it is getting very expensive.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll be honest, I mean, that's influenced me when we're doing our taxes at the end of the year, and we're fortunate, those of us who have some sort of a tie into the beer and brewing world, we can write off some expenses. And so, those are I'm looking at those, and my wife's going over them with me and pointing out, like, look how much it's costing now. And we didn't really change that much from last year. And that's because of the increased cost overall. And I mean, what is a pint? If you were to go out right now to say Wayfinder or something, what's a pint of beer cost?
Yeah. $6 to $7, and probably for a lager like $6, and an IPA would be $7 for like a good pint of craft draft beer at the brewery. However, if a California brewery comes in, they charge California prices.
Of course they do. Well, for us, we're hovering around the $8 a pint mark, and it's just I mean, you hear people talking about it like, it's not worth it. I'd rather just go buy a case and hang out at home, eat my own food, which is way cheaper than food trucks. So all of that, again, it's and what do you do? What can a brewery do to counter that? They either bring in more people, and they've got to figure out a way to do that, which isn't free, or they lower prices, and they've got to figure out a way to do that, which could hurt their bottom line. Which if it's a business, you can't just do that.
No, and this is why I'm grateful I don't own a brewery. It's yeah. Not only is it's the market here is so saturated that it's really kind of scary, the idea of trying to compete with everyone, because we have so many great breweries. But two, it's like the things are not looking good,
No.
And I really do think it's a function of market saturation, because sales of alcoholic beverages, I believe, are fairly stable right now. It's that we're seeing shifting preferences that, ultimately seltzer and ready to drink beverages are eating into craft beer sales, and they're just kind of redistributing where some of the, alcohol and calories are going in terms of different formats. And, look at cider. The poor guys, it was largely a gluten-free beverage in terms of like people were drinking it because they were gluten-free, not because they preferred cider in America. Right. That was a huge movement or a reason behind the rise of cider. And now that seltzer's here, cider sales are tanking. And it's because it's an alternative gluten-free beverage that I might kind of like better, maybe. A really good, funky, interesting cider I would take 10 times over, the basic White Claw stuff. But I could see how a young person that's wanting to be refreshed and have some sort of alcohol in the beverage would prefer a seltzer. And either way, cider probably took some of beer sales away, but now we have people that aren't gluten-free. They can have all the bread they want. They're drinking that because it's, beers taste weird when you're 18, but seltzer, this is a pretty obvious flavor. And so you don't even need to get your palate adjusted to beer anymore. Yeah.
You're moving away from the economical reasons for this, which you and I are going to dig so much more into in the next segment. We've got to take a quick break now. And when we come back, like I said, we're going to get into even more of our opinions on some of the non-economical reasons that we think might be contributing to these brewery closures. We'll be right back. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie, she's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold.
What's up? Jason Tatum here. Ball up wherever you are with NBA 2K Mobile. Playing game events to collect NBA legends and rising stars to assemble your dream team and settle things on the court. NBA 2K Mobile lets you put together your dream team with your favorite NBA legends and current GOATs. Download NBA 2K Mobile now on the App Store and Google Play.
I'm sure everybody who listens to this show has shared the experience of having somebody who sampled, your beer, exclaim with adamance that you should start your own brewery. For many, this is more than just validation. It's actually motivation to jump into a career that involves doing something they actually enjoy. Now, I personally have known a handful of people who have done this, or at least attempted to do it, despite having no actual experience running a business. Well, from where we sit today, Jordan, it's hard for me not to view this as playing at least some role in the uptick we're seeing in breweries closing down. Obviously not all, but certainly some of them at least.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think that breweries are a business. And home brewing, you're really focused on making world-class beer. And, that is just a piece of the iceberg at the professional level.
Yeah, and I agree with you. When you're homebrewing, you can muck around however you want because really you're the primary customer. You're not selling that beer, and your family's livelihood doesn't depend on, a 5-gallon batch of IPA that might have orange peel in it or something. But on the commercial scale, I remember a common saying just a few years ago. I know some people are still kind of living by it, perhaps even more so than they used to. But a common saying back in the day was, I brew the beer that I like, and it just so happens that I'm able to sell that. And then it kind of morphed as the hazy IPA thing, and then all of the different versions of that, from milkshake IPA and sour IPA and all that spun off. It became, well, I brew the beer that will sell because it's a business and I've got to run a business. That evolution, and now it's like, where are we at today? I don't even know. It's not even beer that they're making. Like you mentioned in the last segment, there's a lot more than just beer you're going to find at breweries, which is a great thing because it kind of opens up the interest group of people who are going to come in and spend money at that place. But I do feel like there was this ability for people who weren't arguably prepared, had no business sense or at least any business experience. 15 years ago, they could throw up a shingle and start brewing beer and get a license and sell it and probably do okay. There are actually some very, successful commercial breweries today where that's how they got their start. But I think that was purely a function of the time that we were in because of how big and how poppin' the industry was. That can't happen today. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of the breweries that were started by folks who were kind of hoping to catch that wave and missed it. I think they're some of the ones who are the first to have closed.
Yeah, again, it all comes back down to market saturation. If you're the only game in town, you're probably going to do okay. And those days are gone behind us. So now breweries that are coming out are really need to have a unique value proposition to the market that they serve to give people a reason to come to this, different brewery compared to the one across the street that they've been going to for years.
When we were talking about Cascade and the Rare Barrel, something that occurred to me is that, 10, 15 years ago, one of the ways that you distinguished yourselves if you were hopping into the brewery game was to do something unique. And in the, for the breweries like the Rare Barrel and Cascade, and there are others out there, Almanac was another one, their unique thing was sour beer. I don't know if in the world we're in today, likely as a function of just kind of the waning interest in beer overall. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's almost like you can't go the specified route. You can't really have just one specific thing that you do incredibly well. You have to have a broader tap list, as it were. You have to, if you're going to do sour beer and that's what you're known for, fine, but you've got to pair that with Belgian ale and lagers, well-made lagers, IPAs, maybe even some classic English ale or something so that the few people that you're capturing to make it into your brewery have options to choose from and want to come back and drink it again,
Maybe, because it depends on the style, right? So you got to think about the market share of given styles. And I'm not looking at the numbers right now, but it's something like half of packaged beer sales are IPAs.
Yeah.
So if you make a popular style or family of styles, and if you make them well, I think you can have a successful style-specific brewery. But let's be real. Basically, that means lagers or IPAs. Bierstadt is crushing it with the German style lagers in Denver, and then down the street is Cohesion, who's crushing it with the Czech style lagers. But English only breweries, like what's the one in Denver, Hogshead, I don't think they're doing as well as Bierstadt, right? And then you got a place like Monkish or Treehouse or, whatever that's really focused on IPAs, and they got lines down the block.
Yeah.
And so if you can make a hypey style and make it well, I think you can do the style specific route, but the days of sour only breweries, I think, are behind us. And even things like, name a successful Belgian brewery in America, right? It's hard to find one. And we know that the Lost Abbey, they've had their struggles, and Tommy Arthur's been very open about those and talking about downsizing his brewery just to stay open.
Yeah.
And the Commons was a really good one here in Portland 10 plus years ago. They couldn't make it because there's just not a really strong market for Belgian only beers. As amazing as these styles that you and me know that they are, English is the same way. And so I think that if you're going to be style specific, it's got to be one for the masses.
And I would contend, like, if I'm a consultant and somebody's coming to me and saying, what do we do? My thing's going to be like, you got to have like 4 or 5 great lager recipes in your pocket. You got to have a couple different types of IPA in your pocket, and then have a rotating tap list of other stuff to bring people in. You got to have cider, or not cider, seltzer these days, maybe even a slushy machine on, like that's what's going to keep people coming back. And it's, we're at a time, and you've mentioned the term market saturation a bunch. We're going to focus on that specifically here in a minute, but we're operating in a time where there are various reasons that a single brewery isn't going to bring in the number of people that it would have 10 years ago. And that's got to be a driving factor in who, if you already own a brewery, if you're planning to open one, you've got to keep that in mind. You can't just go the old school route of I brew the beers that I like to drink and, my customers can figure that out for themselves. That will not work these days, unless what you like to drink is what everybody else out there is paying for, which I don't think that's the case. You have to offer a wide variety of options.
Yeah, and then what's the classic phrase? Like it's like a triangle, right? Like you can have it cheap, you can have it done well, or you can have it done in a short amount of time. Pick two.
Yeah.
And I think that brewing is kind of like that, right? And that the three legs of the stool might be high quality beer, a high quality in-person experience, and maybe location or maybe price or something like that, right? And you can't have just one anymore. There's a really, really good lager brewery that you know and you love, and I won't say it on the air, but their Portland tap room is embarrassing. It feels like a doctor's office.
Yeah, I've heard.
And so it's like, oh my gosh. And then food. Food's a big part of it. They don't have food, right? And so if you can have a really amazing taproom experience with great food, your beer doesn't have to be as good. And meanwhile, if you have really incredible beer, the brew nerds like me, we're going to pop in and have an amazing, Stein or something like that. But you're not bringing in the masses. If you don't got the location, you don't got the experience, the taproom experience, you don't have the food. You need more than just one of these things for this thing to work anymore in terms of an on-site successful, taproom experience.
Yeah, I think the number one thing a brewery has, or that will, I guess, keep a brewery around and keep them in business. You mentioned it a second ago, is hype. And how do you get that these days? You still, I think people are probably still, in love and infatuated with, I should say, breweries like Russian River and, Treehouse and Bierstadt's one of them. I know, if I'm going to Denver, I'm going to Bierstadt. That's just the way it's going to work. And I think, back in the day, there used to be this mentality of new or I guess brewers who were in planning or maybe considering going into it. Part of their thought process was, well, I'm not looking to be the next Russian River. That'd be great and everything, but I just want to take a little slice of this pie. And so you could go and make a small little tap room and brew in the back and keg it up and serve it the next day. And you would do really well because there was just so much interest. People were doing brewery tours. There was a lot of pub crawls. That's just not going to work these days. Those breweries that have the hype may be able to maintain it, but they're doing it because they're making a genuinely quality product, and doing what they can to get that out there, to market it, to go on, podcasts like this and to talk about it. And I just don't see in this market, at least where we're at today. And I do believe that everything ebbs and flows and we just happen to be in a lull right now, but we'll pull out of it at some point. I just don't think that's going to work. And we're going to see a lot more closures that I think are going to shock us, in part because of that lack of business sense, that lack of preparedness, not knowing how to budget, not knowing how to manage a team or even hire a team of people to keep your business afloat.
Right. And let's get into it there. That's what happened with Cascade. The owner suddenly tragically died, and his family were not brewers or brewer business people. And they inherited this factory, right? And and also, I guess, there's an article from New School Beer online if you want to read more about it, who's a local beer writer here. And I think the family, there was some confusion around ownership, and the ownership was supposed to change, and they didn't realize it was actually still in the father's name. And so when push came to shove, they're like, we're not prepared to run a brewery. I'm sorry, we're closing.
Yeah.
You need a succession plan.
Exactly. And what are your options? You either sell it like the Rare Barrel did, or if that's not going to work, you just shutter. You close your doors and do what you can moving forward. One of the things I think when you think about the breweries that are closing or breweries that are likely going to close soon, I think it's only fair to talk about size being an issue. I mean, obviously Anchor was kind of an exception just given their clout and how long they've been around. They're a relatively large brewery with decent distribution networks and all of that. And they still couldn't, make it through. But I recall listening to a podcast years ago where the host commented that anyone who wanted to start a successful brewery should budget upwards of $1 million or north of $1 million. And while I'm aware that there are some smaller breweries who are able to kind of be successful by not doing that, kind of piecemealing together their brewing system, starting really small on the nano scale and getting out of it. I think for the most part, those are people who got started during that really hot time in beer and brewing where they were able to generate revenue on that small scale and then build out larger and larger and larger. But you look at more recent openings locally here. Crone Wolf's a perfect example. Their starting budget was about $2 million. That's double what I believe it might have been Jamil Zainasheff was recommending at around the time he was starting Heretic. And they're doing well. And you go and you look at what they've built. They didn't start on the nano scale. I mean, they started big. They had they're still brewing on the same setup. They've got bigger tanks. They've got a whole bunch of tanks now. And I think in order to really bring in the revenue, you have to be able to push enough beer out, right? That recovers those costs.
Yeah, it's a Goldilocks equation, right? You got to hit that sweet spot. And Freem is a good example. They started big, and they have since expanded and now have a production facility, which is crazy.
Crazy.
Have you been to Freem?
Yeah, I have, in Hood River, right?
Yeah, in Hood River, in the tanks are massive for a taproom experience, and yet now they've got an even bigger production facility. And so but if you start too big, you can be too big to fail. But I think that there are corporate ownership is relevant here, right? Because Anchor probably was successful enough on its own to continue. However, the corporate interests that held it did not see it as profitable enough to justify its continuity.
Yeah.
Right. And so if, in fact, it had been owned 100% by the employees from the first place, I don't think that the writing was on the wall that they needed to close. But when you have these massive corporate interests that have these crazy standards around profitability, things can start to get cut quickly. And a great example of that is Widmer. So Widmer Brewing is in Portland, Oregon, and they're probably the largest regional craft brewer in the Pacific Northwest. And if you don't live in the Pacific Northwest, it's not that relevant. But if you're out here, I mean, it's like every ball game, every grocery store, every gas station, from the smallest coastal town to the biggest, tap room in the city has Widmer. And they make great kind of macro craft beer. And they had this incredible tap room with this incredible restaurant, and they had all of these one-off beers that were brewed that you could only get at the tap room. And the food was really great as well. And when AB InBev bought a majority stake or majority interest in the brewery, they quickly shut down the restaurant, and then not too long after, they shut down the tap room. And so all of those amazing, innovative tap-only offerings, which were super world-class examples of style XYZ, all that went away because they were like, we're a beer factory. We are not in the hospitality industry. That's a different business, and that's not what AB InBev does. So you are closing that restaurant, and Portlanders never get to have that Reuben and beer cheese soup ever again.
God, now I want a Reuben and beer cheese soup. Yeah, and Widmer did some really creative stuff early on, even before the AB InBev stuff, if I'm not mistaken. They partnered with Red Hook and Kona, I believe. And Red Hook is the Seattle equivalent, basically, of Widmer, which, like you said, everywhere you go in the Pacific Northwest, you're going to see, or you would have seen, Widmer, Red Hook, and then more recently Kona. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the very first, quote, craft beer I ever drank was a Widmer Hefeweizen at like Old Spaghetti Factory right when I turned 21. So it's left a mark on a lot of people in craft brewing from that area. But yeah, your size matters. That's one thing for sure. And then who you're involved with is going to play a role as well. Profit, no matter what, profit does matter. We all have to agree with that. It's just when those bigger companies, and I believe in Anchor's case, it was Sapporo or something like that. When they come in, they've got a lot more people at the top who need to be answered to, right? And so the decisions they make are going to be different than if it's employee owned or if it's just owned by a family or something like that. So yeah, that all absolutely plays a role. But I do think what we're going to see in the future, again, we're being presumptive here, but just, back just 6-7 years ago, if somebody were to come to one of us, Jordan, and say, hey, you Brewlosophy, I'm thinking about opening my own brewery. What's your advice? I think our first bit of advice would have been, well, have you ever run a business before? And they would say no. And we'd say, then you need to seriously consider, where you're going to head with this thing, because it is a business. It's not a hobby. You can't make money off of a hobby. That's where you blow money. You need to go get an education, get an understanding of how to do all of this stuff. You're going to have to hire an accountant. You're going to have to hire all these people. And that would usually talk people out of wanting to go forward and doing it. Those who were able to make a somewhat successful brewery, out of starting that way, I think we're going to start seeing they're the ones falling off first. And what we're going to see in the future, or more, I think sooner than later, unfortunately. But you've mentioned the term market saturation a million times. Let's talk a little bit about what exactly that means and how it happened in the world of craft brewing.
Sure. So in the, quote, scientific sense, saturation, or the market, science sense, saturation reflects the proportion of an item that exists in the market. So like in housing stock, we could say like the saturation of heat pumps, the proportion of homes that have a heat pump as the HVAC technology in their home. And so in beer, it might be the number of breweries that exist in a region, or the number of IPAs that exist on the shelf, right? And so it's all a function of supply and demand. And as long as demand is there, you can have increased supply. But we've gotten to this point where the exploding supply is starting to outpace the exploding demand.
Yeah. So here's an example. I mentioned earlier how when I was living up in Bellingham, Washington in the early 2000s, there was one craft brewery, Boundary Bay, which meant anyone who wanted to drink something other than what was on tap at the sports bar, which was, largely your big name beers, but we had like Mac and Jack's Amber. There were some smaller distribution based breweries back in the day. But if you didn't want that and you wanted something more unique, you would go to Boundary Bay, and they were capturing arguably the entire market of people who were interested in that, who were interested in trying their variety of English ale and IPA and stuff like that. Well, nowadays and we're talking just 20 years later, right? There are something like 13 or 14 breweries that are within almost walking distance of each other in Bellingham, meaning that all of those people, ostensibly, who would have all gone and spent their money at Boundary Bay, are now spreading that out between 13 different places. They have these options. That's going to force all of the breweries that want to continue, getting those people in to rethink their marketing strategies, which again isn't cheap. But it's also going to cause some to just not be able to generate the revenue that they would need to be able to maintain the business that they started. And I think that is a huge factor nowadays that we're seeing this, again, something we're going to focus more on here in a minute, but we're seeing this kind of decline in interest in beer. And so now you've got all of these breweries, you've got this massive supply, but you're losing demand. That's just not a good equation for businesses.
Right. And so, if someone wanted to open a brewery, I would say you want to look for a region that's missing one. And within a city, choose a neighborhood that doesn't have one. And within a state, choose a city that doesn't have one, or that doesn't have 20, right? Because we're just not going to see the same level of demand increases that we witnessed over the last 20 years. And so you really got to fill a market gap, I think, at this point. Otherwise, it's going to be a struggle.
Yeah. And on top of that, so I've thought a lot about this, and this is not a recent thought of mine. My wife and I have talked about, we've visited so many breweries together over the years, and we'll kind of comment on our experience at these different breweries. And the ones that seem to appeal to us the most, at least, are the ones where there's more than just beer that they're offering. There's some form of entertainment. There's some form of connection. The brewer is there hanging out, talking about his beer. I mean, things like that. The point that I'm trying to make is that you can't just brew beer and the beer is going to sell itself anymore. It used to be that would kind of work out. In this day and age, that is just not going to work. You have to have something else to offer, whether that's live music, or brew, or whatever, pub quiz, or something like that. Because again, the beer's just not going to sell itself. Those customers are going to go find some other place to go to get their beer, and they are going to want to do this secondary thing along with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. For an in-person experience, especially at a certain scale, if you're a really small tap room, the equation's a little different, and you might not need games or something like that.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to fill a big space, you need stuff to do beyond just the beer. And I think food is a great example. We're really lucky here in Oregon is that breweries tend to have restaurants associated with them. Not always, but they often do. But there are some places where it's like unheard of. And I think that if you can have great food and great beer, you're going to bring in a lot more people. But just beer alone, that's really hard to pull off at a larger scale.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody a few years ago before we were in the state that we're in now, this perilous state that we're in now, and we kind of came to this idea. At the time, it was in jest, but now I'm kind of wondering if maybe we weren't foreseeing something, that the food truck is going to be the death of the brew pub, right? Because a lot of people may not understand, but a brew pub is a brewery that has a restaurant attached to it. They serve food as well. Now you can have a brewery or a tap room that serves snacks and whatnot, but if you are cooking food in a kitchen and serving it to people at a table, that's what we typically, I think legally, is referred to as a brew pub. And I'm thinking here in Fresno, I think there are 3 breweries in town that serve that are brew pubs that serve food along with their beer, but almost everywhere else doesn't do that. Crow and Wolf doesn't, but they always have food trucks there. Every time they're open, they have food trucks out. They've got them, scheduled throughout the week and all of that. And that is a nice convenience. If I want to go drink Crow and Wolf beer, it's a great thing to be able to have the food trucks there if I'm starving. But you start looking in the same way that beer prices are going up. These food truck prices are outrageous lately. My word. It's like going to a legit sit down restaurant now, when it used to be, 3 tacos for $5. It's now $15 or whatever. So that's something that you got to factor in as well. I mean, now you're, they can't afford to put a kitchen in Crow and Wolf or whatever and start serving their own homemade food. But my goodness, these food trucks, is that going to keep somebody from coming in on a Friday night because they just don't want to spend their money on a food truck?
Yeah, and my homebrew club, we used to always have a pro brewer come do a talk at the beginning of the first half of the meeting, and we had a new brewery who's since closed, many years ago, come speak to us, and they were talking about how if their advice to new brewers is to not open a restaurant, because if you're trying to wrap your head around opening a brewery for the first time, then opening a restaurant on top of that, and you're not experienced in professional beer production, sales, marketing, et cetera, and you're not experienced in, running a restaurant. And we know what the turnover of American restaurants is, right? It's like the divorce rate. It's quite high. Yeah. And so I think that the temptation to bring food trucks in is warranted. And I think that there is a model there if you can have a lot of food trucks, because I've been to breweries, they have one food truck and the line's an hour long.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Even 2 food trucks, you're like, damn, this is a big enough brewery to warrant 4 of these things, which sometimes that happens and it's great. But it's weird because in a way, and I don't mean this the way it's going to come off, but it is a necessary evil to have things like that there, because you want to offer your patrons options like that, when you don't have the capacity to do it yourself. I heard somebody say this a long time ago, that starting a brewery and trying to make a restaurant with it is far more difficult than starting a restaurant and then including a brewery with that. If you are a restaurateur or you're, a chef who has had experience working in a professional kitchen, adding a brewery on just basically means hiring a brewer and buying the equipment and getting the licensing, and you could more or less get away with it. And if you wanted to press pause on that project, you could. If you're a restaurant, you can't do that with the food side of it. You can't turn your brew pub into just a tap room when you've got this whole kitchen, and staff who are making food and stuff like that. So I understand the kind of move away from brew pubs and into just tap rooms that have food trucks and whatnot. And I think it's more good than it is bad. I do think with the rising costs overall, in everything, that's not necessarily going to be the thing that's going to keep people coming back to your brewery. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Well, I think that one thing that's really critical in a brewery persevering is passion. And we had a restaurant here in Portland that built a brewery on site, and the owners, they were restaurateurs, and the beer, I think, was more of a market opportunity. It's like, beer Mecca USA, we should make beer too. And they would cycle through brewers constantly. Like no one would last more than a year because ownership honestly didn't care. And they're like, wait, yeast nutrient? You don't really need that, right? And like nickel and diming them on ingredients, and the equipment was terrible. And then ultimately the quality of the beer wasn't that good because anyone that was worth the salt would instantly get hired at a better brewery, probably get paid more, and also have ownership that was like their purpose of business was to make great beer, not to also have beer at their restaurant. And so they recently closed. The restaurant, they had changed the name of the restaurant to a brewery name, and now they've reverted back to their original restaurant name and have literally shuttered the brewery and are no longer making beer. And their 25 draft system is now all purchased from local breweries around town, and the beer's great because they're buying beer from breweries that care. And so if you're a restaurateur and you don't, and like this is a afterthought, that brewery in your restaurant might not survive.
God, what a sign of the times though. I mean, that's just, you think about it's just so weird from where we've come from, and having been in this scene for as long as I have, to hear that a brewery was shutting down because it wasn't making it, and the food side of it is what kept it going. I mean, it's just wild to me. Now I feel like one of the bigger things we could talk about here, and we're going to have to kind of restrain ourselves a little bit, is just this general idea. I've heard it referred to as beer fatigue, and the various little sub reasons for that. But there is a very real move away from beer right now. And it didn't start recently. This is something that's been going on for probably 5+ years, at least as far as I could tell. But it just seems like people are getting a little bit burnt out on beer in general for whatever reason. I think there are a lot we can go over. But what is that? I mean, is it that we've just had our fill and we're ready to try new things? Are there other aspects to it? I know I've got a few things on my list. What do you think, Jordan?
Interesting. So I think that the numbers that I've heard, it's fairly minor recently, like losing like 1% or something like that year over year, or whatever the metrics are, to other beverage options, in that they're being redistributed away from beer in the percentage realm. So it's not like crazy, like they're losing half the market. But nonetheless, 1% over the entire nation is not nothing. And I think that from my, armchair expert perspective, especially on the West Coast, there's a notable gluten-free movement. When we were kids, you never heard of the word celiac, let alone a peanut allergy. Like every third person is allegedly allergic to gluten. And honestly, maybe humans don't need to eat as much or consume as much gluten as we do. And I'm sure that there are real sensitivities out there. And so I think that is a big part of it, is like, I guess, overall health thing, be it, avoiding gluten or avoiding calories or avoiding alcohol in general. And I think also it is like a generational change. Younger people aren't drinking as much. There's a lot of things they aren't doing as much, given with the new kind of like tech, oriented generation that's coming up, but they're drinking less beer, and seltzer is really become the beverage of choice of the newest younger generation. And so as people age and stop drinking, the new people that are coming in, this is not their beverage of choice anymore. Yeah.
So I'm going to hit on all of that as well, because I think it's a fascinating, the sociologist in me is looking at it going, this is so fun to look at, when we suspend or hang up the reality that there are real businesses out there that we love and support that are hurting right now. Taking that step back and looking at it, at the gestalt, the whole thing, it is pretty fascinating. So, I started brewing when I was 21, 22 years old. I'm 43 now, so it's been a long time. And I have a lot of friends who are right around my age, some a little older, some a little younger, who have also been in the craft beer and or homebrewing, scene for equally as long. And what I'm seeing, it's just an interesting observation, these trends, is that the people who are around my age, understandably, aren't drinking as much for health reasons, right? Or whatever it might be. Their doctor tells them, hey, you got to lay off, you want to lose weight, you've got, gluten issues, whatever it may be, that it fits under that umbrella of health concerns. You're seeing a lot of people move away from it. I mean, I forget, was it Denny Kahn who a few years ago had to move away from drinking pints when he goes out, and he only has samplers now or something? There's a lot of stuff that comes with age that continued consumption, at least at the rates that a lot of us were going 10, 15 years ago, it just does, you can't sustain it, And so there's that piece of it. Whereas I might have gone out and bought 4 or 5 pints on a Saturday night, now maybe I'm only having 1 or 2. And so there's that group of people. Then there's that group who've just completely cut it out altogether. Oftentimes, in my experience, for no real reason other than I was just sick of it. I'm done drinking. I'm doing other stuff now. So there's that smaller segment of people. And then what fascinates me, you mentioned it earlier, is that the younger generation just doesn't seem to share our interest in this form of inebriation, as it were. I went up to my cousin's wedding, and he is about 11 years younger than I am. And went up for his wedding reception. All these friends of his were there, and we're hanging out. I play video games with these guys, and they've got alcohol at the reception. That was great and all of that, but we're talking to their friends, and they just don't have the interest in beer like people did when I was their age, which I think is fascinating. Like for me, if somebody were to say, you want an alcoholic beverage, I'd say, yeah, grab me a beer. That'd be the first thing that my brain would go to. And for this group of people, that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, I wondered, is this universal or is it just among this group of people? I don't think it is. I mean, we're seeing this kind of move away from beer overall, even amongst people our age, Jordan, into things like sparkling water or whatever. But when my cousin's thing, they're making cocktails and drinking wine.
Well, and the sociologist in me, literally masters in sociology here, recognizes that everything is cultural. And so when you go to Germany, the pastor with the, or the priest or whatever is drinking a beer on the train at 4 p.m. in his white collar robe,
I need that.
And then here in Portland, Oregon, beer is a huge part of the culture. And so we are consuming a ton of beer here.
Yeah.
But then you go to other places, like I'm going to New York City next week. There's not a lot of craft beer in New York City. It's like Rattleburger Pills or something, they just don't care as much there. And so a given culture is going to really drive this beverage because it's a cultural experience. It's not shampoo, something you do in private. It's something you do together. You went to Prague, drinking together is huge there. And so when COVID lockdown happened, they had a huge decrease in sales because people don't really just drink alone in the Czech Republic. It's a social thing. And we're seeing this movement in the younger 21 years of age culture that is just moving away from beer, and that could have lasting impacts in the future for the preservation of this beverage. And I think part of it is the cultural norms and the systems in which enforce those. And when you look at Hollywood and influencing and TikTok and all these other forms of media that would influence people of all ages, we see that young people are particularly susceptible to various forms of influence of media, be it television, movies, or now TikTok and stuff. And for whatever reason, beer hasn't really made the register there. It's all about no laws with White Claw or whatever it is. I mean, in terms of the influencing world.
Yeah.
And then when you look at movies and television, craft beer is not really part of the conversation.
Yeah, it is. That's an interesting observation as well. Yeah, but I agree that cultures and probably more precisely subcultures, right? So you end up getting involved in a certain region with certain types of people, and something might grow there, but it stays kind of insular. It kind of is in that region, kind of like Portland, or I would imagine the same is relatively true of places like San Francisco, San Diego, stuff like that. You go to Los Angeles and your options are just as skinny as they are, in New York, which I think is fascinating because they're huge cities that have a large population of people who would probably be into it, but it's just not as embedded in that culture there. One other thing I wanted to hit on, and I think this is an interesting one because all of us have made fun of, the chocolate chip cookie dough sour IPA or all that, whatever, and what it seemed to be was that like what brewery can outdo the one who did the cereal beer or whatever it was. That might appeal to a segment of drinkers. And I think breweries rightfully look at it and say, hey, we're going to do this one-off 7-barrel batch of some weird beer, see how it does. And that'll be kind of one of the things that we put on that extra tap of ours. And we'll swap that out with other weird stuff. You got people who are going to come in just to try that, but are they staying? And what I'm noticing is that it doesn't seem like people are staying anymore. And that kind of niche, quirky type of style, thing, it doesn't seem to be as appealing to people as it was, a few years ago. And I think that's just an interesting thing that you can't do the weird, wonky, crazy thing anymore as your sole way of bringing in new customers.
I mean, I recently saw a real hot dog water beer.
I saw that too. Oh my word, yes.
How sustainable is that, right? Like the gimmick cannot be sold at the same levels of Bud Light or something, right? And then you get into a more realistic, hype or wacky beer, like a thick, luscious barrel-aged imperial stout with like 10 types of vanilla and macadamia nuts, etc. Those are really decadent and really nice. And I think that there is some staying power there, but I think that even Mike Tonsmeyer recently mentioned on a recent podcast that they're finding some level of success with those at Sapwood Cellars, but they're not selling those at the rate that they are their IPAs. And it's just when something is 15% and like has 1,000,000 calories per sip is amazing and as hyped as it may be, you're not going to sell the same volume. And so I don't think you can hang your hat on smoothie sours or other wacky pickle beers and stuff. That I think that it's something to get someone in the door, but they're not walking away with a case of it.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is I wonder the extent to which it's even bringing people through the doors these days. I just don't. I mean, obviously things are going to be different in Fresno than they are in Portland or wherever. But I think on a global scale that technique just isn't working as well as it used to, which may purely, again, be a function of less people interested in beer or whatever it might be. I thought what we would do is just finish this episode off, though, by me asking you just a couple of questions, and obviously I'll provide my responses as well. But I'm curious what your thoughts are. You know, a few years ago, there was a lot of people, old codgers, if you will, who were sitting back watching this crazy thing happen where all of these weird beer styles were coming out, and they did not match what most people thought of as beer. Okay. And a lot of the huff and puff came from, the oldies who were saying, just make beer flavored beer, just make beer that people want. And if that's not good enough, then maybe you're doing something wrong. What are your thoughts on that, considering where brewing is at today? And do you think that has bones? That if a new brewery were to start right now and all they made were BJC, to the guidelines, BJCP styles, is that enough in this day and age to keep a business going?
I don't think it is, but I think that it's a really strong backbone. I think that it's a combination of experimentation and innovation and really great beer flavored beer. And so, for example, I think that it's really challenging to hang your hat on a single IPA recipe for perpetuity. A great example is Bridgeport Brewing. They were one of the biggest craft brewers in the Northwest, probably America, especially at a given time, like say 1990 or something like that. And they didn't change their IPA recipe. And by the time that they closed in 2015 or whatever that was, IPAs didn't taste like that anymore. And so I think that IPA is a particularly notable example. Is you got to constantly evolve and you got to constantly change. Look at hazy IPA. I don't like the stuff, but it really has done a really good job and bringing people in. And in the Northeast, where hazy IPAs were really pioneered, people maybe were getting tired of classic, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, et cetera, and this created some hype. And so being willing to take classic styles and kind of push them to their boundaries, I think is the sweet spot to keep things interesting, but have like that backbone of, beer flavored beer. I don't think a brewery can survive on pickle beers alone.
Well, and in the same way, I'm not sure a brewery can survive on, pale lager alone. We have some great, examples of great lager breweries: Bierstadt, Chuckanut, Freem, Jack's Abbey out on the east. I mean, there are these, but as far as I know, I've visited Freem and Chuckanut, and they're making more than just pale lagers and Vienna or lagers in general. I had a great, British IPA at Chuckanut last time I was up there. So I think you have to kind of open up your what you're willing to produce with the goal of bringing people in. But I'm with you. You can't just be this kitschy, we're brewing all the fun stuff, because there's just not a market for it these days, it seems. Maybe one day it will come back. Do you think things like this are cyclical, that we're going to be back on that rocket ship one of these days in the hopefully near future?
I'm not sure that we are, but you say, do I think things are cyclical? I really think things are regional. And I think that locking into what the regional market demands or wants or is going to want is key there, because I travel a lot for my job and for pleasure, and I notice that you do not see the same level of, quote, microbrewed or craft lager outside of the West Coast. When you go to the middle of the country, a smaller craft brewery, they might not have a lager, and if they do have one, it might suck. And so I think that the middle of the country hasn't come around yet, and they're still in that honeymoon phase where they're excited about non-lager flavors. And so maybe the middle of the country will turn around, but for now, I don't think a lager-focused brewery is the smartest idea in maybe Omaha or something like that, right? Whereas Austin, they've held on, and it's done really well there. So you have to really understand the region that you're operating in and understand what the market demand is there, and brew the styles that region wants, because it really is diverse, and it's like basically like we have 50 different countries in one here.
Yeah, totally, man. I couldn't agree more. And we're not talking specifically just about lager breweries. We're using that as an example. You have to, in any business, you have to brew what the people who are going to be paying you for that stuff want. I mean, otherwise they're not going to pay you for it. So I never liked the whole, I brew what I want and, I'll let everybody else kind of decide on their own. No. That's not a good business mindset. So a couple more questions. What do you feel about the role? We talked about lack of preparedness, and that what we've observed over the years is that those breweries that seem to kind of go out or putter out sooner than later, there was some tie to what seems to be maybe a lack of preparation on their part for running a business in general. What do you feel about the role or how best can somebody prepare for that? Whether that's, a formal education or whatever, do you feel like that's necessary, and what do you think that looks like?
I mean, this would be pure speculation, but I would assume, I don't know that it's necessarily necessary, but I would say it's as close to necessary as one could get. I think that brewing production, I don't know if you need to go to like the Technical Institute of Berlin at this point to make good beer. There are other ways to do it. Check out our YouTube channel. But, you got to know how to make good beer, and how you get there. There's a variety of different paths. However, there are, some of those programs have the business of craft beer. I think that my alma mater, Portland State University, has a certificate in the brewing business. And so the more that you can learn about the brewing business, surely the better you are going to be off in terms of likelihood of success.
Just because your mom or neighbor says that you should start a brewery does not mean you should start a brewery. And I feel like I've been saying that since the very beginning. You're going to have very nice people tell you that you make the best beer they've ever had. That's one of the fun things about homebrewing. You get your buns buttered in that way, but that doesn't mean that you should start a brewery. There's so much more that goes into it than just making a 5-gallon batch of beer and sharing it with people. You've got to know, we've talked about it already. You've got to know how to budget. You've got to know how to manage. You've got to know how to do so many different things. And if you want to be successful, I mean, unless you come from wealth and your parents are, we've got a local brewery that's the story, is their parents were loaded, built out this beautiful brewery and the beer is shit anyways. And so, learn how to brew. If you've got the money to do that and you're willing to risk it, learn how to brew a good batch and maybe you'll make it. But otherwise, I don't think right now is the time to be jumping into the game. That's my personal opinion. Maybe there are areas like you mentioned, Omaha or something, where there's just kind of this dry landscape when it comes to beer. Maybe something would be successful there. But right now, what do we do, Jordan, to keep the breweries that are around, that we want to stay around, besides the classic answer of go buy their beer? I mean, what can they do? What can we do as consumers to ensure that this doesn't get too bad,
Yeah, I think that you have to make great beer at this point, especially in advanced markets like the cities that you mentioned on the West Coast. If it's not truly world-class, you're not going to survive. I think 2 is a really quality taproom experience, if that's the over-the-counter sales is what you're going for. And I think that set and setting is really critical. Just a really great, design, the vibe, the look and the feel, friendly staff, great food. A quality on-site experience is huge to the success, because if they come in, they might take a 6-pack home, or they're like, I've had that beer on draft. It kicks ass. I see it in the grocery store. I'm getting a 4-pack. And so I think that great beer and great experiences, those are the keys to success. I don't think you can survive on simply existing anymore.
God, I couldn't agree with you more, man. And it used to be, create a unique beer and that's going to bring people in. I feel like now the folk, and particularly with the younger generation, they are the experience-based generation. You create a unique experience, and that's what's gonna make those people feel like they're connected to you. And I feel like that's an important thing that a lot of business owners in general, but particularly in brewing, miss. Is it is not just your beer; it's you as well. It's what you present on social media. If people feel connected to you, if they feel like that is my home brewery, not home brewery, of course, but that's my place. These are my people. I want to go back there because it's where everybody knows your name. You know, it's the Cheers phenomenon. People go there because they want the experience, not just for the beer. And I think you have to go into designing or building a business with that mindset, or you're going to lose out, especially with where we're at today. So on that note, final question for me, Jordan, because I'm so curious, where do you see things going in the immediate future? And, are we at the tail end of it, or is this just the beginning?
My guess is that more undersaturated markets like my hometown of Oklahoma City will probably still experience some moderate levels of growth, but even then, I think that it's starting to taper off there. So I think that we're going to kind of be in a turnover phase where we're going to be gaining as many breweries as we're losing. I think that it's probably going to be a lot of smaller breweries that are more likely to turn over, although we'll continue to see large ones. But ultimately, and I've thought about it like this for years, is I think that breweries are basically becoming a restaurant in America, where every town has a bunch of them, and some survive and some fail, and new ones come on as old ones go away. And it's no longer this like $1 billion idea, and it's no longer like massive production factory stuff. It's a small community restaurant, and that the food that they make is called beer.
I love that idea, and I really hope that given where we're at, that is kind of the spin that ends up happening. I tend to be annoyingly optimistic. You know, I never would have guessed that in my lifetime I'd be witnessing what I'm witnessing now in this industry. And I think maybe my perspective has been influenced by that experience. I unfortunately think that we're going to see a lot more of this horrible, stuff that's happening right now with breweries. And, for better or for worse, one could argue, when you suspend your emotion, there's a part of me sometimes that goes, you know what? Maybe they shouldn't have gone into it anyways in the first place, because the beer was never that good, or whatever the excuse might be. But then again, these are real human beings behind these businesses, and I hate to have to see them, struggle and reconfigure their entire life when it comes to a career and generating the money to support your family and stuff. That part sucks. But I do think we're going to see a lot more of these closures in the future. I hope that's not true. And that's going to lead us in a decade from now to wherever we end up, landing then. And it could be a good thing. Who knows? I'm trying to stay optimistic about it, but unfortunately, in order to get to that place, we are going to see, I think, more stuff like this, and it's not going to be fun, but it's kind of like the wringing out of the rag. We went through this phase of hyper growth and people willy-nilly starting these breweries that happen to be successful on some level for a limited amount of time. And we're at the end of that now, and we have to kind of reconfigure and see where things are. So that is all the time that we've got for this episode. I know for a fact there are a lot of people out there who have plenty of opinions on this. Like always, if we get back a bunch of feedback from our listeners, maybe we'll turn that into its own episode, just addressing the feedback from other people on what they're thinking about or their opinions on these brewery closures. But as it is, that's what we've got. Jordan, do you have any final words before we close this one out?
Support your local brewery, support your local homebrew store. It's on us to keep this business alive, this industry, and it's the best industry on the planet, and it's what we love, and so we're just as much a part of it as well on the consumer side. Yeah,
without a doubt, I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, don't forget to listen to and subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Kate takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage, and make sure to head to brewlosophy.com to stay current on all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we are up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.